Okay, I know that we're just filling up our group here, and I think in the interest of time, Amy is eager to get us going. We have about 30 minutes today. I'm Suzanne Tuff. I'm the Scientific Director for the Alberta Centre for Child, Family and Community Research, and the Interim Scientific Director for the Strategic Clinical Network in Maternal, Newborn, Child and Youth Health with Alberta Health Services. So I think today our first task is to introduce ourselves to each other, and then we'll approach the questions. And I think the idea is we'll make a few notes on the flip charts, and somebody will report back to the larger group. And I'm going to pick on Bev here to start to introduce herself because she's a familiar face and she'll get us all going. Bev?
Hi everyone. I'm Bev Parks. I'm the Executive Director at Norwood Child and Family Resource Centre, but I also sit on many more of the provincial collaboratives and looking at child and family and what we do within the province of Alberta to move that forward and how we shift the practice of what we're doing. So.
My name is Mandy Abrams. I'm with the Edmonton Chamber of Voluntary Organizations, and we're working specifically on looking at supporting human service agencies in Edmonton to align and collaborate and innovate more effectively.
My name is Bill Clement, and I work on the board of directors for the Alberta Centre for Child, Family and Community Research, and I'm retired. So, enjoy.
Hi, my name is Lynn Wade, and I'm from the Winifred Stewart Association, and I support individuals with developmental disabilities, find employment or volunteerism on an individual basis to help build up that social identity.
Hi, I'm Katie Walker. I'm a community social worker with the City of Edmonton. I'm also supporting the Community Wellbeing Working Group, which is part of the task force the Mayor has to end poverty. And tonight we are looking at our recommendations for what we will put forward in draft form, and Lynn is part of that, and so this is amazing.
My name is Shinji Tsui. I'm the Chief Analytics Officer at the Alberta Centre for Child, Family and Community Research. And what we do, what I'm responsible for the center, is to look into existing data, whether it's research data, administrative data, or service delivery data, and we link that and we do research to inform policy. So, yeah.
I'm Debbie Clark. I'm the Executive Director of the Today Family Violence Help Center. So we're one of those innovative service models where we're the one-stop shop, the first call, the wraparound support, bridge connections for individuals who have been abused, and we've been open for about 5 years in Edmonton.
I'm Janet Mosier, and I'm with RBC. So RBC Foundation is a sponsor here. I specialize in working with not-for-profits, so she thought it was very appropriate for me to be here, and it sure is. Love hearing about what you guys are up to.
That's very exciting.
Yeah.
So if we come up with some good ideas, we can then get a business plan between
There
your
you
skill
go.
and Bev's skill. I'll be done in 30 minutes.
Awesome.
So I'll try and take some notes, and between Shinji and I will try and facilitate the conversation. But the questions we've been asked to address are, what did we learn that's new and inspiring? And so maybe we'll start with that one.
Start then, or?
Yeah,
sure. Well, for me, like I was a student of psychology in the 90s, way back when, and so it was really interesting to see that change of about the person, but about how we relate and how we're tied into our community, and to see that research is around that, because we haven't been really successful in addressing issues of mental illness and addiction, and also to see the professor of mine from Simon Fraser, Bruce Alexander, like his work from like the 70s actually coming out, and seeing how important our environment is to our own personal health. So that was really exciting to see that. To see that being the main thought, the social identity.
Helps us figure out what to measure.
Yeah.
For me, I wasn't aware of the work in economics that related to the identity issues, which to me is a gigantic improvement to ground economics in the real world. Because was taught a long time ago, and it had all these assumptions that weren't real, and now it seems to be grounded.
I thought the economists wanted to become epidemiologists because when they put the word actions and cognition, I thought that's right.
Yeah, for me too, was the economist. I love that he was able to do that because I've been thinking a lot about narrative actually and how we create a narrative about the work we do and about the sector that has sort of applicable for more than just the postcard with the child with big eyes on it, right? How do we create different narratives? And gives me hope.
So interesting for me, I guess, and we were having a conversation at the break, and it goes back to how we have research policy and then the practice and how there's still that disconnect. Because when I was looking at this and I'm thinking, okay, first of all, this is not new. We already know this. Common sense tells us from a practical perspective, we already are doing some of this. And so I don't mean to be the naysayer or the challenger, but again, it talks about until the researchers name it, put it out there, and show evidence, which I think is really crucial, for sure, do not get me wrong. But until we have that, then there isn't the ability to then talk to the practitioners at that level and say, now how do we bring the two together and do the learning? So while there was learning there for me, but I think I'm always inspired when I see policy and practitioners coming together to have these discussions, because we don't do enough of that. So we have this level and we have this level, but we're missing what's happening so that we can work better, perhaps differently, or scaling up some of what's already happening, but have the evidence to address it.
Can I just ask a question? Are you aware of instances where practitioners have led to the policy discussion?
Sorry?
Where a group of practitioners have caused the policy discussion?
Yes.
So
Yeah.
that happens a lot.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Covered what I wanted to say.
Katie and I were talking about very similar to Bev that, the research affirms the work that many of us have been doing for a very long time. Client-centered, person-centered. I mean, the words keep changing, but I mean, we've been using these models for a long time. So sadly, we're still in a place where in a lot of instances where practitioners haven't been effective in informing policy, perhaps now that we have this research to go along with it, I think will be very helpful. And also, maybe it's just because Bev, you and I end up in so many meetings together, and Mandy, but I've seen there's this new language called pracademia that's like circulating, and maybe it's because I'm currently working on an applied research paper. But the question is in here, and I guess I leave this with the group, is that I think that's where we need to go next. Like, we have good relationships with some researchers through community university partnership, or within our sectors when we used to get together very regularly, and now reorgs and policy seems to have not made that happen anymore. So I'd be interested to explore some further questions around not only how will we apply it in our work, but what's next as far as connecting that academia and the practical pieces and make it applied research, like research that we actually start to apply.
Well, I agree with that one. So I hope you'll send a note to the center saying you want more funding that way. See what we can do.
Hope you don't have any other funding, and we need funding, so that would be good.
For me, it definitely brought the social identity sort of thinking to the front. Like many have expressed, right? We all know the importance of sense of belonging. We all know the importance of being part of a bigger whole, right? We all know, these things would benefit, and we also want those. Everybody wants to be part of a group, a part of something, right? But I think, if you consider the next question, how you apply, actually I was thinking, the talk was going on, thinking, how we, in my research, our research, we often break up by age, gender, these are groups, but they're so large, you do identify, when you're older, you identify with that, but really, can we think about other groups where we can take a walk, right? With our research. So I think that's very helpful to me to really now thinking explicitly about how social identity could help to improve the outcomes of the population.
And I'm just thinking out loud, Shinji, when you say that, we could map social identity without measuring it because we would have neighborhood indicators of things that create identity.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, we do that. Like ethnicity is a big one.
Right.
Usually people, but but there are other things
we could go deeper if we thought about it and used other sources of data.
That's correct. Yeah. So getting into the lower levels.
Well, I don't know if my comments are about what's new, but I think the timing is so important. So one of the things that's happening with the Poverty Elimination Task Force is there's analytics that they're developing where they can really map out, and just commenting on, just connecting with what you've just mentioned, mapping out very specifics about what in communities, what helps bring better health. So for instance, if you live close to a park, it's been shown that you, like within 1 kilometer, you have better health outcomes, and there's so many different layers that can connect to that. But for my work with doing community work, I just see the concept of groups and what groups you belong to is so critical, and part of what I do is try to connect different groups together, whether it's social agencies or professional groups, but sometimes the groups that are missing are the people who are experiencing, the vulnerable communities, because sometimes they're hard to reach. But I've had the great opportunity to do some engagement the last 2 weeks with vulnerable communities who feel part of the organizations that they're connecting to, and it's so inspiring that really what does matter is what groups people belong to, and I've never kind of had that perspective, in such explained so eloquently as today. So
it's good to have the language around it too.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. And certain things we don't really talk in that kind of language is, for instance, organization identity. Like whenever we do organization planning, or we always identify vision, and we're trying to impart that through the whole organization. So we all identify with it, and we feel that camaraderie, and we work together towards the same goal and purpose, right? So
maybe this makes it more transparent, talking about the need so you can be more intentional in creating those group processes and recognize the value in doing them in different places too.
Well, I think this research speaks to, groups and community neighborhoods aren't necessarily static, right? They can be changing and evolving all the time. And that whole reflection piece of just very basic, like Bev said, just ask them. Like, what do you want your group to look like? And we do this, right? But it was just like a nice reminder, like, ask. Like, just very basic. Yeah.
I think the thing that has been missing, and so when you think about, how do we apply this, it's not necessarily how do we apply it as much as it is how do we apply the research or the evaluative and the evidence to the work that's being done, because I think that, you know, it's also, we tend to always say, well, we're already doing that. This is just affirming that. Well, we're not always doing that. Like, let's be frank. There are some things that if we paid more attention to the research or to the evaluative piece, it might change the way in which you might apply that at a practical level. And so I think for me, what's been, even in this last couple of years, I think as a practitioner, is taking the research and the evidence-based and applying that to the work, and then looking at how we can always be evaluating what we're doing as we move forward. And that's where I think we are going to start to decrease that gap between the research and evaluation and the practical. And as we start to do more of that, it'll come like this, and it will then become a natural piece of our working together and looking at those measures and how we do that. But I think the other thing, there's some other work that's being done right now in the research and looking at from a family violence perspective, and you probably know about this, Deb, and the work out of Calgary and Brenda Stafford is that, and the fatherhood piece, and how they were looking at that natural gathering and how important the natural gathering groups are to actually form some of that base in order to move forward. And I think we just need to be paying more attention, and I think we need to be doing more reading and having more conversations and asking better questions.
I think that's certainly helpful. And sometimes we call that in our world intervention integrity. It's not just, as we heard, having people come together. There are some strategies that make groups more effective that we can measure, and I think when we fail to measure that, then we don't know why some of our interventions that are supposed to work don't work. And then we haven't the evidence to say these steps all mattered, or some of them mattered more or less. So, other places you guys will apply it.
Well, we're doing some. Okay, sorry. We're in the question.
Apply it in your work.
Yes.
That's right. Well, you can merge it all. It's not
Okay.
totally essential.
Sorry.
But Bev sort of picked up on where we would use it in our work.
Because I work as a job coach, so of course I think apply. I'm thinking, you know,
Apply for a
the
job.
Where am I going to apply for a job with this? I think is helping and have that kind of mind shift in our work culture. I think we'll have to have some just really candid discussions about, what does it mean, our roles as, thinking of ourselves as helpers, and they're the helped, right? Which I think really has a huge impact on how we value them, and I think we have to get ourselves out of that. They're not people that this is not, these are not people that need to be helped, right? We're thinking about, the health of our whole society. It's, and thinking about them individually, but how they connect out. So for me, it is going to be like having those discussions. So, because again, like you were saying, like we do have a lot of these person-centered, policies and processes in place, but are we still treating people like they're the helped, and we're not seeing them as very valued people in our lives, in our communities.
I think we heard a little bit of that from the panel, and I've also heard it explained by other economists about the need for reciprocity. So sense of belonging doesn't come with it all just goes out.
Oh, yeah.
There needs to be intentional reciprocity.
Yeah, if it's a charity case when you're connecting people in the community, it's a charity case, it's not gonna be meaningful for either. It's going to be a lose-lose situation.
Or effective.
Yeah.
Well,
right.
and look at the impact on the Aboriginal community. It's recolonizing them. So we need to really be aware of how to do things in a way that is respectful.
Yeah, exactly.
It was interesting along that line. I heard this CBC idea, that program, and they talk about tolerance. It's interesting, and they couldn't tolerance about, we talk about tolerance. tolerance, because when we talk about that word tolerance, is you presume that these people you're tolerating are something wrong and different, so you need actual tolerance. You need to put yourself down to that level of tolerance. So that's not something we should.
They actually gave a historical definition of tolerance,
That's
which
right.
was the willingness to not do harm to others because they are different to you. That's actually technically the definition of tolerance, which was like, oh, it's actually, wow. Like, yeah, that was a bit of a mind trap. It was very interesting.
Right.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
should I write down we'll elevate ourselves beyond that concept? Is that how we'll apply that?
But
To
it's,
me,
you
it's-
really go back to the original meaning of tolerance.
It is just awareness of that when you when you think about how the social identity would work, is that you have to be fundamentally respect everyone and really believing we're all created equal. So without that, you just that's that's what I
suppose
believe.
from a social identity perspective, it also is that in that context of tolerance, it's about understanding what people's how they actually define themselves, how they see themselves, how they interact, and I would see that that's how you would bring a social identity framework to that, to actually understand what constitutes that person's self. What are the factors that are important aspects of them, and how do they actually sort of try and live those aspects out? And that, I think, will actually contribute to greater tolerance. If you can understand that person's perspective from their self-identity perspective, then it's going to sort of bridge that tolerance, I think.
And the challenge in
Yeah.
I was just thinking the challenge of that in urban centers is that everybody's driving their car and there's
Yeah.
not places to go.
Yeah,
That bring people together and
So there's that sort of structural
yes, we need to have some
aspects.
structures
Yeah,
to
and
bring those opportunities.
And I think that sort of question about social spaces and manageable social spaces where people can actually come together safely and want to come together in those sorts of social places in order to be able to interact in that way. Because there are places where they don't exist, as you say.
That's interesting. It's also culture. You're saying it's city planning or more of how we think lifestyle kind of thing, but it's also culture. When I come to the Western culture, one thing I have to learn is to respect people's privacy and knowing that distance, and you have to make an appointment before you knock on their door. But that's not true, in the culture I came from. So people just jump by, they do things, and they never really, they really make themselves at home when they come. So, sometimes annoying. Yes, there is that aspect, but really it also warms your heart. You think about that, you just feel very close to them. So you do have that kind of opportunity. But here, Western culture, especially North American culture, I find it's very individualistic. So there are definitely benefits of that, but in terms of promoting social identity and interaction, it is a bit of a challenge.
Yeah.
I think I should say in taking it back and applying it at the Today Center is the staff and the clients we see have long been looking for these different types of ways to group. So not don't re-victimize me and re-traumatize me and send me to those types of groups, but I want to be part of a group where I could just journal or just read or just do art. And we've had a real challenge in doing that bridging work as part of our work with other organizations to kind of bring that together, right? And sometimes it's taking this language, I think, and starting to talk about different place-based approaches, and it's sometimes about the structure, so having maybe this place in the community that they could go to, but where can we look at existing spaces that aren't thought of, right? Like, why couldn't we do an art group right at the Today Center, right? So starting to use some of this language you shared with us in the research and kind of supporting some of the conversations of where we want to go, because being able to develop that group and a group that's supportive for them and that works and to allow individuals to group themselves, not say here's this self-help group and it runs Mondays and Thursdays at this center, right? But start to think about how we can apply this to allow those processes for some of the people we're supporting to group themselves, right? So once we hear, 2 or 3 people, if they want to be knitting, then, let's see how we can get innovative and start a knitting group, and maybe it's at our center first and then it moves to a community agency, right? So, yeah.
We call knitting group Stitch and Ditch.
Well, I think by using this as the language, but what we want to do is we want to be able to influence policy, right? And we want to be able to influence practice. And so you can look at that from a variety of levels. But I think if we're able to say these are the practices or the models that work, and this is why, then it allows people to think through a different lens. So I think about community planning, I think about transportation, I think about housing and that. And if we use that kind of a lens, it really will influence policy. So how you develop a neighborhood, how that is planned for, how you build in whatever the services or supports that are needed would be in that neighborhood, so that that would allow those types of things to happen. So it's right from the practical, let a group begin, to right up to the higher is we need to use this as a lens and to help us when we're looking at how we would develop a new community out in Southeast, or we have 60,000 people coming into Edmonton. How have we really used that lens in the way in which we apply the development of these areas? So I think that's a piece of our problem all the way through this, is we're not looking through the eyes of a child. We're not looking through the eyes of what a family requires. We're not looking through those eyes of, the social innovation and that type of thing. So I think we can influence policy in that way if we're applying it.
Maybe that influence is more neutral because it doesn't have an againstness to us. It's just about the practical environmental supports that help all families and the typical things that happen. So maybe it has less discrimination associated with the language than an addict or a homelessness or a youth at risk or whatever. So maybe that's an easier marketing tool too.
I know that many of you experienced that we develop these community building capacity events or whatever to bring communities together, and no one shows up. Right? Like you think in
the same people.
Right. The same people, yeah. Or it was a preaching to the choir kind of situation, and I think about my father. Who, I'm giving all the pamphlets that he can have for the senior centers, all the activities he can get involved with, and groups and support groups with his cancer, and blah, blah, blah. He's like, every day he's going to McDonald's because they got 55-cent coffee or 65-cent coffee, meets with the people that gravitate there, and, along the concept of complaining and and grumbling about, younger generations, and I think it's fantastic, and it's so organic, and it just happened. And the funny thing is that when I was traveling throughout, down through southern Alberta in the States and up through BC, we stopped off at breakfast at McDonald's. There'd invariably be a group of old guys and old women together. Yeah, that are
important sometimes too.
Yeah, well,
They're all over the city.
Yes.
But how many groups of women do you see like that?
well, there were some women in his, but
Not many.
they're predominantly male, yeah, for sure.
Especially in the rural communities.
Yeah, in the
they're
rural
mostly male.
communities, they both come in from the farm often for coffee in the morning.
I'm just thinking the ones that are running to,
But it's interesting to me that
But it's non-stigmatizing, right? And it's organic, as Lynn said.
Yeah.
And it's a neutral place, and it's affordable.
Yeah, and so it makes me question my intervention, and what I do. Yeah.
Yeah, we try to enforce artificial groups on people.
Yeah.
And so what? Again, it's that message. Go back to the people and say, where are your groups? Who are you connected to? Like when I did this engagement with a church in Beverly, and the homeless, 3 of the homeless fellows said, our group is each other, and we are, and we have each other's back. And I had no idea. I just assumed that they're all individual people looking out for themselves, but they have a group.
And you know, Katie, but I think what's happening is we're not asking the right questions. We're not asking the right questions. So I go back to what Lynn and you're talking about, and I don't know who the we is or any of that, but it is about imposing rather than inquiring and then walking alongside. So, you know, it's the parents or the community members, and they're saying this is what we would like. Well, we tend to take it over here instead of empowering them and walking with them and letting them figure it out or design or that type of thing. And I think until we start doing that a little bit more, I think that's where we're going to see some different results. Because it just goes back to what we're always saying, we're not the experts, right? We're not. We're just part of.
Nope. I just, you know, I go back to that word assume, and I think that's what I'm kind of hearing. We're assuming. We think we know what they want and what they need. I like what you say about McDonald's, and I work with a lot of seniors homes, and it's amazing how many little groups are formed, and it's a little ladies knitting group, but they formed it themselves. It wasn't organized, but that's what those ladies wanted. And then they take it a step further. They go out to the community asking for wool. I don't know, I've got bags of wool at home that I had good intentions. And you give it, and then they make, you know, the toques or the mitts or the scarves, and they feel so good. And I think
they bring them to us.
Exactly, and the schools, the inner city schools, so which is where my daughter works. So it's a whole circle, right? And so
self-identify and self-select in that way. There is a lot of evidence out there in organisational settings and beyond that actually show that that's a much bigger magnet. And it has a longer life as a result.
So for those, can you sort of facilitate, reinforce, support as, you know, programs and services? Do you find there's helpful?
Yeah, and I think that certainly there's organisations that we've worked with where they actually try and provide that facilitation, but then transfer some of that ownership and empower champions amongst the people who are taking part to continue working on that dimension. So initially people might feel very uncomfortable. They might not feel confident in being able to sort of facilitate these groups, but it will happen. And sometimes it does take facilitation and sometimes it's not necessary. So it's really going to be very much dependent on the people who are taking part, the people who might be driving it, and obviously, as you say, not to step on, you know, let it have a life of its own.
I work with a population, adults with developmental disabilities, and they have lived a life of being pleasers and not having any self-direction, and I find that appreciative inquiry is such a long endeavor, and you have to be really creative to have some sort of understanding. I don't think a lot of people will put that investment in time, but it is something that has to, I guess, like I always use the word organic. It has to spring on its own time, and appreciate that they have their own sense of time. They have their, you know, but it's. Yeah, I'm expressing a real challenge for me because they're just like, well, what do you want me to do? You know, and it's tough. You know, and I've got a lot of great ideas, but you know what is it what would you get? And I guess it's just like being in the moment every time and seeing when the face brightens up, and that's the only reliable indicator I feel like I have is like, okay, oh wait, I'm seeing the rise, that physical rise in their body. I'm seeing, you know, that they're doing things that, you know, usually they're quiet, but they're talking now. You know, I'm like, okay, now we got something here, you know, and work with that.
I wonder whether I can ask questions since Catherine's here. I was going to ask but didn't get a chance. So all of this, we didn't mention social media. So there are a lot of groups there. So what's the effect? Would that be different from the traditional sort of social groups
It's
we're talking
interesting.
about?
So I don't think we have enough evidence theoretically. So a lot of our interventions are being driven by the theory, and the theory would actually say that, look, it's the social connectedness that's the important aspect, and so it shouldn't matter what facilitates that social connectedness. It's when you actually feel bonded and connected that it should actually be as impactful. So theoretically, social media should be as impactful as face-to-face interactions. We haven't got those studies, and we're trying to get some funding to be able to do some of that research with a colleague in Kansas, and seeing whether we can actually use social media. And we're actually sort of linking this in, working with older people but who are living in the community, linking it in with exercise groups and looking at the group therapeutic component of doing this in groups versus doing this individually, and doing this through social media, through all of these interesting apps that people now have to connect socially, even while you're walking, versus doing this face-to-face. Because it might be something about, okay, if it's face-to-face, there might be some level of intensity, some issues about I identify faster. Certainly what we've seen is that when some seniors have identified faster, they got the better cognitive benefits for some of the interventions, reminiscence interventions that we've actually run. So there might be these other factors that we're not taking into account in our models, so we need to test them.
It would be more about the personal development of learning how to use it and have that interaction with a trainer. I thought that would probably be the biggest,
Could well be, yeah.
I think what's interesting about your research is it's not like sectorial and it's not issue based, and I think that's the challenges for us as practitioners is when we're looking for that evidence-based research, there's very little of it because it's done by sector or by issue. So because there has been some social media research done around supporting victims and those who are abusers of family violence, but when you go and look at it, there's so few studies, and you know, even sometimes you look at the methodology. So I think that's what's so exciting about where you're going is it's not issue based, it's not necessarily place based, but it gives us that overarching kind of, you know, theory that we can then take and look at our own work and see what we can do. So thank you for that. I think it's huge.
I mean, apart from Groups for Health, all of our previous interventions have been working with organisations who are basically coming to us, and we start negotiating. Well, we're confronting this problem. How might we deal with it? So we're in a table with residents, staff, and we start negotiating. We start talking about, well, how might we sort of develop some solution to this? Once we're actually working as a group, that's when we also have the commitment of the organisation and the staff working within the organisation, because they feel that they've been part of it too. So it's very much been driven by the ground level problems that people face, and looking for a solution to that ground level problem. And we've just been very lucky to be able to be working with a number of organisations who've been willing to work with us in that way.
So Catherine, Shuji had a question, and lots of us here work in children and youth.
Yeah.
So what are the early childhood interventions that prevent this exclusionary activity by middle school or grade 4?
That's a good question, because that's not where my expertise comes from. I have some colleagues who are working with a very privileged group of young people who go to what they call churches in Brisbane. And these are kids who come from very wealthy backgrounds, parents are diplomats, it's a live-in school, boarding school. And you would think that they have all of the resources actually thrown at them. And despite all of those resources, they're suffering. But because they have resources, they actually came to our department and talked to a number of researchers, social psychologists, who they're now trying to work collaboratively with to see whether there are some solutions to some of their problems. And forming social connections and being disconnected from where their sort of standard home connections are, you know, like their friendship networks, their family networks.
Hello, welcome back everybody.
That's been
I'm going to invite all the groups to please come back to the main plenary room and we'll have a report back.
So my colleagues are going to be starting to work on this issue.
Right.
Hopefully. And I'm hoping that we can kind of
Good.
latch on to some of that, because we'd be very keen to see whether we can adapt some of our solutions that we've been working with adults and older adults to a younger age group.
Well, you'd also be interested around the parents, and so
Exactly.
like about building
absolutely.
parent capacity and looking at the types of sessions, education, parenting, all that we're offering, and is that where we're seeing those outcomes, or if we were allowing them to be building their own informal social networks based on their interests, what would those outcomes be?
And I think that as part of it is education at that level too. We need to sort of educate people about how you can actually sort of tap into those networks and how to use them most effectively.
Yeah, I think Amy's calling us back. Was that right?
Thank you. Thank you for letting me do it.
Okay, everybody, let's take our seats. We'll have a report back from our 6 discussion groups. I hope everybody's nominated somebody to report back on behalf of your group. Who's our spokesman from, or spokesperson from group number 1?
Raise your hand. Nice and high. I see no one.
Where was group 1? Over here in the corner.
Group 1 was right here. How about group 2?
Okay.
Group 1,
Number 2, group 2. Would you like to share some of the thoughts from your group, please?
Well, I have volunteered on behalf of Group 2. What we learned, we said it was evidence-based, so it was informative. Of course, we did recognize the language of us and them. Other issues that were raised, of course, is that not everybody is aware of groups or the groups that they would belong to. So there is the groups piece as well. And I think it informed us about thinking what is meaningful in terms of our work environment as well. The other piece, I think, is it may not be applicable to all groups, because some of them have already been doing it. If we think of our indigenous peoples here, they do have that social identity, but there are so many other, the challenges they have is more complex than not just belonging to a group. There are historical colonization and oppression, and of course on top of that, some of the other things that have been caused because of those experiences. So the other part, question number 2, what will you apply? I think we said we will take it to our groups and we will share it with our colleagues at work, and it can be applied in our inform our policies for some of us. So some of the concepts could be introduced to group dynamics within our work environments, and that sense of inclusion of people in programs as well, the whole social inclusion. Number 3, how will you apply it? Of course, again, sharing it with our colleagues. We need to inform and educate others, and maybe take some of the videos that will be produced. I think there may be a video that's produced, or use the scarcity video as well. So use some of the current available resources or whatever will be produced from here as well. And encourage people to reflect on their work and the policies that they do. So it is about empowering individual behaviors within our work environments as one. So this is a summary of I hope I've done, I think, a combination of notes as well.
Thank you very much. Moving on to group 3.
Thanks, Amy. And I'll just try to summarize for my group, and they will chime in, I'm sure, and help me where I've not got it quite right. I think one of the things that was highlighted by our group was the change from looking at outcomes from an individual level to an inclusive group membership level as a metric for health. And we talked about appreciating the economic emphasis that was brought to bear. A lot of us are in health and human services, and so it broadened our narrative to think that other people were also interested in these content issues, gave us some new language. We discussed a little bit about the research policy practice disconnect, and then Bev in our group said really it's a new frontier for pracademia, which so practice-based research, I've heard them in medicine called pragmatic clinical trials or whatever, and so I think lots of people are thinking how can we get better evidence from what we're currently doing. There was some affirmation that our practice models actually did include some of the attributes of social inclusion and cohesion, and we talked about social identity being more succinctly defined in terms of both belonging to a group and then having some responsibility back to a group, so it wasn't just a one-way street. A further comment was that this was really good timing because lots of people are preparing year-end reports or future planning, and they'll be able to incorporate the language. And some of our new analytics we thought we could use to better understand social identity without necessarily having to have primary data collection. So that was exciting for some of the data people in the group. Thank you. In terms of application, we had quite a few frontline organizations in our group, and there was a thought that we could use this intentionally. We can map things, we can analyze our data. There was some reassurance that this research really can be applied to what is intuitively known in practice, and again just gave us more courage to go forward with some of the strategies that are already underway. We had some further discussion about the concept of the helper versus the helped, and I alluded to that in terms of both responsibility and belonging, and so to be respectfully engaging our customers and being aware of social identity as part of a component of our frontline practice. We talked a little bit about how we could apply it in terms of changing the structure to bring about new opportunity and incorporating and understanding cultural differences as these applied to changes in structure. And again, some new language around place-based approaches that people thought they might use, and how these place-based approaches could lead to new models that included things like transportation, community planning, and service and supports. I think I'll just end because we had a few adjacent questions, but we thought some of the application could also encourage us to ask better questions and to inquire as opposed to impose when we're trying to develop some of these strategies to improve social identity. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Suzanne. And group number 4.
Did I get it wrong? Anything to add?
Okay. So we had a wide-ranging discussion. One of the big takeaways for people was that, of course, group identity is important, it's obvious, but we often forget that when we're actually putting into practice. People found it helpful to sort of learn the language of the discipline and know the terminology that's being used. And finding out that there's actually this research backing for intuitive conclusions that people have come to in their own practices. Some of the, what else do we have? There was a lot of, I guess, additional questions and ideas about how this could be applied. So the need to think of a flow between researchers and people, not as subjects, but as people. We talked a lot about leadership and the challenges between what you'll have in leadership classes that are in many ways talking about these things and identity and valuing people, and then when that's actually put into practice in business, the same sort of principles don't always apply, and that it is important really to think about, as was said, group identity when you're trying to institute organizational change. Opportunities to, back to research, opportunities to connect with clients without overly emphasizing the measurement. So again, treating them as people, not just data points. We talked about some of the causes of what was seen as the increase in individualism and how that's reflected in urban design and in our economics dating back to the Industrial Revolution. And now we're starting to, in some ways, see a bit of a movement back towards more social identity and group concerns that were perhaps lost for a period of time through the 80s and 90s. And yeah, I think that's about it. Did I miss anything? Anybody from the group? Yeah.
Somebody, I didn't catch her name because she came in late, but she made a really good point about how we used to do things more group-based when we had less resources, and then when we have more resources, we don't, but that's not good. So she, I think, unless I'm misrepresenting her, she basically said, there she is, that it's a good thing that times are getting tighter because it will force us to go back to some of these more effective / less expensive group approaches to certain things. Yes?
Thank you. Group 5.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Jerry Lynn. Our group didn't so much go through the questions that were posed to us, but just started talking. And so we spent quite a bit of time talking about the needing to address the how the dominant group influences policy without and ascribing needs and kind of creating approaches with non-dominant groups. And so needing to flip that around so that we are respective of group identity and that there is self-determination inside those groups in terms of their own health and development. We talked about being able to develop qualitative as well as that we can't express our qualitative outcomes without having quantitative outcomes because that's where the money lies, but the importance of being able to do that and recognizing identity inside of those outcomes. We talked about groups changing throughout the lifespan, so from a student through a retiree, that our identities change as a result of where we are in our lifespan. And we also talked about ascribing, not thinking or paying attention to populations and ascribing good things, so or what we think are good things. So as an example, I'm with Canadian Mental Health Association, and one of our service streams is providing housing. And we recently had a new apartment building built, and we are very excited to have a community room in that building for our 27 tenants. And that room has essentially remained empty because that is not their community. Their community is with other groups outside of that building. So it's pretty expensive real estate. We're still trying to figure out a good way to use it, but I think it's a good thing for us to think about when we are making plans for others. Thank you.
Thank you. Group number 6.
Yeah, my name is Kate, and yeah, we talked about a lot of the same points that have been raised already by groups 1 to 5, but I think there were about 3 things that we spent our conversation on. We had quite an eclectic group, like most of you did, people from the museum field, from the municipal field, from working with the provincial government. We were lucky to have Robert join us from U of C, so that was great. And interesting to see that we had some of the same questions and challenges. So one of the 3 things I wanted to mention is that we really talked a lot about shifting attitudes and shifting the way we come at problems or issues or challenges, less from an individual point of view and more within that holistic sort of connection to community. And so I think that was, in doing that, we talked about a lot of examples, and it sort of reflected the group around in Group 6 there. We talked about the Edmonton Public Library and how they're envisioning their role, their own identity in a different way, and what their role is to try to welcome everyone and to make everyone feel a part of what they do, and how they're, in fact, responding, whether we call it action or policy, they're responding to new needs and to new demands in the community in a really creative, innovative way. We talked also about, someone mentioned a seniors care home where they had talked about something called butterfly homes, where they really engaged the residents as they wanted to in serving food and had the staff join the residents to eat and have meals. So again, challenging that traditional stereotype of what a seniors care home is and how it operates. So we talked about lots of those examples. We also had quite a discussion around the identity-centered policies and what that is, what it means, what it could be. I think a number of people felt that we often over-engineer solutions when solutions can be simple, can be intuitive, don't necessarily have to be linear, and don't have to be over-structured, that's important. And someone mentioned in the field of early childhood that they're working in, they said that we know that it's the everyday interactions that are so important. It's not those structured, policy-driven kinds of actions and programs that may have that lasting input. We really enjoyed having Robert talk to us about his work and his involvement with the Autism Society and what propelled him to join and become involved in the Autism Society, and how a really negative reaction to the workers that he and his family were dealing with propelled him and many other people to look for other solutions and other groups and other identities. So although it was sort of a negative origins of the story, it ended up with a really positive outcome. And I think in terms of, we didn't have much time to talk about how we take this back, but I think we all sort of thought that this idea of the identity-centered policies and the shift in attitudes is something we'll take back to the work we're doing when we're looking for innovative new solutions. Thank you. If my group has anything else to add.
Thank you. Let's circle back to our last group, number 1.
Thanks. Yes, a lot has already been covered, so I can be really brief. I think the general consensus in our group is that it was inspiring and validating without necessarily being new. It's that whole preaching to the choir thing, I think, which always happens. But it was inspiring in part because of the spotlight that is being placed on social connectedness as a basic health and well-being issue. We think that is absolutely inspiring. And we also talked about and appreciated that there is still a long way to go. And the group just wanted me to share this anecdote. A few years ago, my research group was involved in evaluating a parenting training program in Alberta. A study involved about 1,000 parents that we got out and talked to. And I guess what was a little bit surprising is the parents came back to us, and quite consistently with the same message, and that was, oh yeah, it was nice to learn some skills that'll help me manage my child's behaviour. But what I really valued was the opportunity to connect with other mums, the sense of belonging that I came away with. And so many of those mums were their husbands were maybe working on the oil fields and so on. There's a real issue with lots of temporary workers moving in and out and the social disconnection associated with that. But I took that message to a senior person in the ministry. And, you know, the message that I got back was, you know, the government doesn't want to hear that money's being wasted on these mums chatting over coffee, you know? And, you know, again, it just seems to me it just reinforces for me how important it is that we keep putting a spotlight on how critical social connection is and the informal learning and so on that can take place through those opportunities that we create. And following on from what the previous group was talking about, yeah, it's not just about imposing or offering up structured off-the-shelf solutions. In fact, when it comes to social connectedness, that's probably impossible, but it is about creating opportunities for that to emerge, perhaps in a more organic way. And that's because social identity has to be owned, right, by the people themselves. I'm not sure if other group members wanted to add anything to that. We're all good? Great.
Thank you, David. Okay, to wrap things up just before lunch here, I'd like to let you know that after today's event, there will be a summary report produced. That'll include some of the themes that we heard from the day. That will be distributed to participants, those who registered, as well as the presenter slides. And all of the recording from the webcast and those slides will all be on the CIFAR website as well as the Centre's website at www.researchforchildren.com. And details on future sessions with the Ideas Exchange series are currently being developed. And the next event, as mentioned this morning, will be held in Vancouver in partnership with the BC Ministry of Social Development and Social Innovation and BC Partners for Social Impact, and in Toronto with United Way Toronto. So I'd like to thank all of our speakers today. So thank you, Alexander, Franco, Catherine, Martin, Robert, Alan. Thank you very much. And I'd like to acknowledge the coordinating committee that put this morning together: Rebecca Finley, Robin Blackadar, Kathy Scott, Amy Cook, and Amy Castor. We'd also like to recognize our suppliers here: the venue, the Chateau Lacombe, PSAV, our audio-visual support, and A-Squared Communications for the webcast. And I'd like to invite everybody to join us for lunch up in the swirling restaurant on the 14th floor, I believe it is. And just wanted to end with one thought from somebody that said this in our group as we've thought about children and reflected on children a little bit today. And he said, children like to play with others who are really good at playing with them. And I think that's a neat way of thinking about things and how we interact with other people. So thank you very much for attending today.